Imagine you're asleep in a small village on the coast of England. It's early morning, the fog is thick, the sea is quiet, and then you hear it. Not thunder, not a storm, but something worse. A low, rhythmic sound, like wood scraping water. Then shouting, then screaming. You open your eyes and smell smoke. You step outside and see men running, and on the horizon, emerging through the mist, are long ships, thin as blades, moving faster than anything you've ever seen. The men on them are not soldiers in shining armor. They are not noble warriors. They look like predators. They leap onto the shore with axes, spears, and shields, moving like they've done this 1,000 times. Because they have. They don't come to negotiate. They don't come to conquer politely. They come to take, to burn, to kill, and to vanish before an army can even arrive. This is the Viking Age. And the truth is, the Vikings were far more savage than movies show. Not because they were evil, not because they were monsters, but because they lived in a world where survival demanded brutality, and they became terrifyingly good at it. When people think of Vikings today, they picture a romantic image, a brave Norse warrior with a beard, a dramatic cloak, and maybe even a horned helmet, something that, by the way, Vikings didn't actually wear. We imagine heroic explorers, fearless fighters, noblemen with honor. But the real Vikings were something else entirely. They were raiders, slave traders, arsonists, psychological warfare experts, and in many cases, they were the most feared people in Europe for over 200 years. And today, we're going to step into their world, not the movie version, the real version, the version that made entire kingdoms panic at the sight of a single sail. To understand Viking savagery, you have to understand where they came from. Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages wasn't a land of wealth and comfort. It was cold, rocky, harsh. The soil was thin, farming was difficult, winters were brutal. If your crops failed, you didn't struggle, you starved. And in that kind of environment, societies become hard. People don't survive by being soft. They survive by being ruthless, disciplined, and willing to take what they need. Many historians believe that population growth and limited resources helped push Scandinavians outward. And once they realized how rich other lands were compared to their own, there was no going back. Because if you lived in a poor village in Norway and you discovered that England had monasteries filled with gold, why would you stay? Viking raids weren't random acts of violence, they were business, organized crime on a national scale. The Vikings targeted places that were easy to hit, rich in valuables, and poorly defended, and nothing was easier than a monastery. Monasteries weren't fortresses, they were spiritual centers filled with monks who had no weapons. They were full of gold chalices, religious artifacts, silver crosses, rare manuscripts, food stores, livestock. In other words, monasteries were treasure chests guarded by prayer. The Vikings didn't fear prayer. They feared nothing.
In the year 793 AD, Vikings attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria in England. This raid is often seen as the symbolic beginning of the Viking Age. And it wasn't just a robbery, it was a nightmare. The monks recorded the horror. They described men arriving from the sea like demons. They looted sacred treasures, destroyed buildings, killed monks, and took captives. It terrified Christian Europe, because this wasn't war between kings, this was something different. A sudden, unstoppable storm that could appear anywhere along the coast. And after Lindisfarne, the message spread across Europe. The Northmen are coming, and they are merciless. The Vikings didn't just steal gold, they shattered the idea that holy places were safe. For centuries, people believed churches were protected by God, that monasteries were sacred, that no one would dare violate them. Then the Vikings arrived and proved that faith doesn't stop an axe. This psychological impact was enormous. Europe wasn't just afraid of being invaded, they were afraid that the world was ending. In fact, some Christian writings from the time interpret Viking raids as divine punishment. That's how terrifying these attacks were. Not just physical violence, but spiritual terror.
Vikings didn't want fair fights. Fair fights got you killed. They preferred shock, speed, and terror. Their longships were technological masterpieces. They were lightweight, fast, able to sail oceans and rivers, meaning Vikings could strike coastal towns and also sail inland, attacking deep into enemy territory where nobody expected them. They didn't just raid ports, they raided the heart of kingdoms, and they hit so quickly that armies couldn't respond. By the time soldiers arrived, the Vikings were gone. Only smoke remained, and bodies, and silence. Once the Viking reputation spread, their mere arrival caused panic. Villagers would abandon towns, monks would hide treasures, kings would scramble to raise armies. Sometimes Vikings didn't even need to fight. They could simply show up and demand payment. This is where we get the concept of Danegeld, money paid to Vikings to make them leave. Imagine paying criminals not to rob you. Now imagine doing it regularly. England did, because it was cheaper than war. That's how powerful Viking terror became.
Movies love showing Vikings as proud warriors, but they rarely mention the uncomfortable truth. Vikings were major slave traders. Slavery was a core part of their economy. When Vikings raided a village, they didn't just steal valuables, they took people, men, women, children. Captives were chained, transported, and sold. Some ended up in Scandinavia as forced labor. Others were sold through trade networks stretching across Europe and into the Islamic world. The Vikings traded slaves in places like Dublin, which became one of the largest slave markets in Europe during the Viking Age. This wasn't rare, this wasn't occasional, it was normal. To the Vikings, people were profit. Many people forget that Vikings didn't just raid, they built cities. And one of the most important Viking settlements was Dublin, founded by Norse raiders in the 9th century. It grew into a powerful trading hub, but much of its early wealth came from raiding Ireland and Britain and selling captives. Dublin was essentially a pirate capital, a place where human lives were bought and sold like livestock. And if you were taken alive, you were lucky, because the alternative was death.
Now here's where we need to be honest. The medieval world was violent everywhere. Anglo-Saxons, Franks, and other groups also committed brutal acts. The Vikings weren't the only violent people. But the difference is this: the Vikings specialized in sudden terror raids. They made violence fast, efficient, and unpredictable. They turned warfare into a business model, and they made it personal. Because Viking raids weren't about territory at first. They were about breaking communities, stealing wealth, and disappearing. It felt like being attacked by nature itself, a storm with axes. Crazy stuff, if you ask me. If you've watched Viking media, you've probably heard of the Blood Eagle, a ritual execution where a victim's ribs were cut open from the back and spread outward like wings. It's one of the most horrifying stories associated with Vikings. But here's the truth: historians are divided. The Blood Eagle is described in later Norse sagas, written down centuries after the Viking Age. It might reflect real brutality, or it might be exaggerated legend. Some scholars argue it was misinterpreted poetry. Others believe it could have happened, but rarely. So what can we say with certainty? We cannot confirm the Blood Eagle was a common, real practice, but we can confirm Vikings absolutely used brutal public violence and executions as intimidation. Even without the Blood Eagle, their reputation was earned.
Now let's talk about the men who terrified even other Vikings: berserkers.
Berserkers were elite warriors described in Norse sources as entering a trance-like fury in battle. They fought with reckless aggression, seemingly immune to pain. Some accounts describe them as biting shields, screaming, and charging like beasts. Were they real? Yes, there is strong evidence berserkers existed, mentioned in multiple Norse texts. But their superhuman rage may have been exaggerated over time. Some historians suggest they may have used intoxicating substances, such as alcohol or possibly hallucinogens, though this remains debated. What matters is this: even if the myths are exaggerated, berserkers represent a real Viking truth. Their culture admired controlled violence, and sometimes uncontrolled violence. People often ask, did Vikings have honor? Yes, but Viking honor didn't mean kindness. It meant reputation, strength, revenge, loyalty to your clan, and the ability to respond to insult with violence if needed. In Norse culture, being seen as weak could destroy your life. It could mean losing land, status, and protection. So men were expected to be hard, to fight, to retaliate. Feuds could last generations. Killing wasn't always considered evil. Sometimes it was considered necessary. And that worldview shaped everything. In 865 AD, a massive Viking force known as the Great Heathen Army invaded England. This was not a small raid. This was conquest. The army fought its way across Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, capturing major cities and destroying resistance. They took York. They forced kings into submission. They established Viking-controlled territories that became known as the Danelaw. England wasn't just being robbed anymore, it was being carved up. And for the English, this was a nightmare that lasted decades. The Vikings weren't visitors, they were occupiers.
Vikings weren't just strong, they were adaptable. They could fight on land and sea. They could retreat quickly. They were experienced warriors from constant feuding and raiding back home. And they were fearless because their religion taught them something powerful. Death wasn't the end. A glorious death in battle could lead to Valhalla. Whether or not every Viking truly believed this, the myth created a culture where dying violently wasn't shameful, it was heroic. That belief alone made them terrifying opponents. One of the most consistent features of Viking raids was arson. They didn't just loot, they burned. Why? Because fire destroyed enemy resources. It sent a message. It created chaos. It made communities unable to recover quickly. And it made survivors spread stories of horror. A burning monastery wasn't just a crime, it was a symbol, a warning. And in a medieval world made mostly of wood, that was devastating. Entire towns could vanish overnight. Here's something movies often ignore. Vikings didn't just terrorize peasants, they attacked powerful kingdoms. They raided France repeatedly. They sailed into Spain. They fought in Ireland and Scotland. They even reached the Mediterranean. And in 845 AD, a Viking leader, often believed to be Ragnar Lodbrok, though historians debate the identity, raided Paris. He forced the Frankish king to pay a massive ransom to make them leave. Paris, one of the most important cities in Western Europe, paid Vikings to go away. That's not a small raid, that's humiliation. England spent generations fighting Viking invasions. France built defenses specifically because Viking fleets kept sailing up rivers like the Seine. The Vikings didn't need to defeat armies head-on. They exploited weak defenses, divided politics, and slow medieval communication. They were ahead of their time, not in technology alone, but in strategy. They were like a modern hit-and-run force, a medieval special operations unit, except far more brutal. Movies portray Vikings as almost mythological warriors. But in reality, most Vikings were farmers. They weren't raiding every day. They lived ordinary lives, until they didn't. Raiding was seasonal. It was a way to gain wealth, status, and resources, and it was an opportunity. If you returned home with treasure, you could buy land, gain respect, attract followers, maybe even marry into power. So violence wasn't just brutality, it was social mobility. And that made it even more dangerous, because it meant thousands of men had motivation to raid, not just a few. They were also colonizers. Vikings didn't only destroy, they settled. They built new societies. They colonized Iceland. They settled Greenland. They reached North America around the year 1000 AD at a site known today as Los Olmedos in Newfoundland. This is historically confirmed through archaeology. So yes, they were explorers, but exploration wasn't peaceful. Settlements often involved conflict with locals, and Viking expansion could be violent. Their story is not clean, it's complicated, and that's what makes it real. The Vikings weren't savage because they enjoyed cruelty. They were savage because they lived in a world where mercy was weakness, fear was a weapon, slavery was normal, raiding was profitable, death was expected. They didn't have modern morality. They didn't have modern laws. They didn't have modern safety. They had survival, and they did what worked. That's what made them terrifying. They weren't monsters. They were humans in a world that rewarded brutality.